I think a lot of people tend to ask about why someone like Jordan Peterson is popular. Why do people like Jordan Peterson when more or less his entire philosophy, like his whole goal, is just to spout the same stuff you've heard over and over again? To just say the same things we've all heard from our parents. Why is that resonating with people so much? Why is it so popular? And I think the answer to that question is kind of simple. He just said the things that have always been true, that you need to clean your room, etc., and explained why. He gave you a reason to do it and told you how it would materially affect your life in a positive way. And then people grabbed onto it. It was really that simple, is that all you really have to do is just tell someone why they have to do something, and then they'll do it. If people don't have a reason to do something, oftentimes they won't do it because they don't know why they're doing it. It's kind of a basic human thing.
A common idea about psychology that you can probably pretty easily see online within the kind of circles that I entrench myself within is that the space that you live in or the environment that you cultivate is reflective of your mental state. It's reflective of who you are on some level, and it can act as a sort of almost feedback loop in the sense that what you're putting into the environment is reflective of where you are at that time, and what you're putting into the environment also reflects what you will inevitably get out of it, thereby reinforcing that specific mental state that you're in. And I find this theory very interesting because I've always been, in my mind, a very disorganized person, but I don't consider that to be a bad thing the way that people would traditionally consider it to be a bad thing. And I think a lot of where those stereotypes about disorganized people come from is from this emphasis on having orderliness within society, that the people who do not fit in tend to be the people who cannot organize their mind to the extent that the rules make sense to them and that they're able to fall within the rules in a orderly way. That's just not who I am. That's never been who I am. And so it's not so much of a stretch to say that someone like me would also be disorderly in terms of environment, in terms of the environment that I cultivate. But I enjoy that. I find that to be something deeply comforting because I've lived in so many different homes and so many different kinds of environments, with the tenor of the situation always being markedly different from one another on some level, either in terms of the climate that I was in or just the house being radically different. I've lived in so many places and so many different types of environments that when I look back on all of the different ones that I've lived in, I notice an uptick in my own mood, a consistent uptick when I'm in an environment that I'm able to find peace in aesthetically. When I look around my room and I say, this is my space, this looks nice, this feels nice to look at. And I don't think that that's unusual of a thing to be thinking. It's just that the way in which I'm thinking it is unusual to normal people because the kinds of aesthetics that I like tend to be very disorganized. They tend to have a radical density in terms of like the things that are in the environment, where there's lots of shelving with things just sort of thrown about all over the place. I like having paper everywhere. I like chaos. I like the environments to be chaotic, but in a very specific kind of way. Like the images you see on image boards of these very messy rooms of like the guy just sort of sitting at their computer with the CRT there, and having the whole environment be based around this sort of chaos, this disorderliness, this inefficiency in the way that people would typically think of efficiency is to me the most efficient way of doing things, because it brings me a sense of comfort that I can't really put into words. And people would hear that and they would think, that's insane. You don't think that way because that's not the way that you're supposed to think. And at that point, how do I justify the way that I think to other people? One of the worst pieces of advice that I ever hear, a piece of advice that I've actually given myself before, is clean your room. Just clean your room and everything will be okay. I found that the cleaner my room has been, the worse that I felt, because there's a part of me, a very large part of me, that just clings to and feels comforted by messy environments. And partly, I think it's because those were the kind of environments that I grew up in. My house was always very disorderly growing up as a kid. I mean incredibly disorderly. We owned lots of stuff. We just never threw anything away. There was always a bunch of stuff in the house. My room was an absolute mess at all times. And you never got the sense that, like, people could come over here and see it as a normal place. That's why we basically never had visitors growing up. And I enjoyed that. It felt like I was wandering through an adventure of sorts, that each time you went into the kitchen you were going to find something that you did not intend to find, because it turned out that something got lost in the vast slew of things that were around. There's a certain charm to it that words just can't justify. And I don't think I should need to have words to justify this feeling, outside of me simply saying, I don't think the same way that you do, and I've had enough experience of both scenarios, clean and unclean, to be able to tell you with certainty that I do not think the same way as you. That's as far as the justification for these feelings can go. Otherwise, I'm just talking in circles about the way that I grew up and the kind of environments that you've been seeing throughout the course of this video. That physicality of media, that emphasis on making your environment reflect the way that you think, and deriving a sense of comfort from how closely it reflects how you think, or how closely it mirrors your interests, how your environment is reflective of a sort of character, that everything you do is reflective of a broader identity outside of what would be considered normal. Like, my whole life I've despised normal things, and I found that being normal, or falling within what is typically accepted, is incredibly boring. And I have had this, like, emotional drive that just pounds inside of me to say, this being normal is wrong, that I want to be unique, I want to be different, I don't want to be like any of these things. And at the same time, in obsession to be understood and to be accepted by other people. But when I was able to make myself accepted by normal people, I felt more alone than ever, because I wasn't accepted on my own terms. I was accepted on their terms. And as I was doing that, I kept having this great sense of longing for something else. That when I was in my room, when I was able to be in an environment that was just tailored around, these are all of the things that I like, I suddenly didn't feel alone anymore, even though I was completely by myself. And how do you explain that to someone, How do you explain to someone what it feels like to have self-perception be like your main motivator in life? That you feel emotions so strongly that your self-perception and these kind of indulgent things that make up your isolated life be the determining factors in how you live that life. I don't know how to put that into words for people, because it is something that is incredibly emotional, but as time goes on more and more, I find myself connecting more and more with that, with who I was when I was a lot younger, when I was a kid, that person who was just infinitely fascinated by material things, and my imagination, the things that I could conjure up in my own brain, and the how I could tool my environment to be more aesthetically pleasing or just aesthetic in general. And my interactions with other people too, when I'm around other people a lot of the time, even people who I do gel with really well, even people who mean something to me, I get that feeling that I'm alone while I'm with them. And I end up going, back into my room and doing the things that I've been doing all over again, thinking in the same patterns that I've always been thinking in. And I don't know how to explain that to people. Like, sort of the whole gimmick of this channel is that I'm supposed to be putting these things into words for them to make sense to you, or I'm supposed to be relaying the emotions of them in a way that's effective enough for you to get it without me having to say any words that explain these things directly. But identity, sort of as I view it, or uniqueness, unique qualities, being different, partly I see it as an act of rebellion, that like, I hate normal people so much, and what normal people represent, I resent them so much, that any way that I can, I would want to be different from them. That isn't to say that I would want to be so radically different that I become inauthentic, but like, those people are so fundamentally opposed to everything that I think and believe that I just feel bad for them. Like, I feel genuinely bad for normal people. And maybe that makes me a pretentious asshole, but I don't know how to think any other way. Or like, I look at people who go to work every day, and when coronavirus started, they just started going insane because the only thing they could do was just go to work. Going to work was their mindset. That without work, they had absolutely no structure in life because they couldn't bear to withstand their own thoughts. Their own thoughts terrified them because they either didn't have any or they had been ignoring them for so long, and that ignoring them is the only way that they can possibly be alive. I feel tremendously bad for those people, that they just cannot function being inside of their house. Part of it is resentment, that I hate that people like that exist. But also there's a feeling of genuine like empathy that those people feel like that this is such a terrible thing that these people have to be like this. And maybe that's me seeing myself as like above other people for thinking in the way that I do, but I really don't. There are aspects of my thinking that have gotten me into quite a bit of trouble, or have I've been unpleasant in certain ways. I don't think anyone should ever be like a mirror of me. That's not the point of any of this. It's just that the differences that I have with normal people that I don't think are problematic necessarily, or that I think are better, I can't help but see them as something that strengthens my resentment towards those normal people. And I have, I think, probably a lot more hatred than most people do towards large majorities of people. And it isn't the kind of active hatred where you're just angry all the time, but it is a type of hatred. Like, it's a type of hatred where you think, I just want to be off in my own little corner of the world, and I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to have anyone bother me where I am. I just want to be off in my own little corner, and for everyone else to leave me alone. And I felt like that for a long time. When I was in school, I never wanted anyone to pay any attention to me. I would always sit alone at lunch, or I would always try to make myself known as little as possible when I was in class. I would never raise my hand. I didn't want people to pay attention to me. It just felt disgusting when people looked at me. I didn't want to be looked at. I just wanted to be alone. That I hated doing my work, but the only way I could make doing my work bearable was by not interacting with other people, because the more that I interacted with other people, the worse that I felt. As there was the disconnect between me and those people was so fundamental, not in terms of just like interests or the way that we thought, but it felt like I was an alien, that I was an alien when I was around those other people. And so the more that I talked to them, the more I just felt more and more alone. And that's why I say that when I'm alone, it feels like I'm the least alone that I can be, is because the environment that I'm in control of, and it isn't as though I'm completely I've completely cut off any desire for social interaction. That's not true. But the kind of desire for social interaction that I have is very different compared to other people, because it's in the context of active resistance in one instance, and also just a general sense of withdrawal. I don't know how I got into that rant. I mostly just wanted to talk about rooms because I've been thinking a lot about rooms, but it ended up being a broader rant about my problems connecting with other people. I don't know how No Thank You tells me that I'm a regular person, quote unquote. So he told me something he told me something like a week or a week and a half ago, I want to say, that it kept sticking out in my mind. He said you're just a regular person who's been forced into irregularity. And I keep thinking about that again and again. Like, what does that mean? You know, a regular person who's been forced into irregularity. Because when I look at these feelings and when I talk about them, when I verbalize them, they really don't seem regular at all. Maybe, I mean, you could say that it's a product of the circumstances that I came from, but what how does that fundamentally differentiate me from anyone else who's weird and the circumstances made them weird, you know? I found it very strange when he told me that. And so I keep on thinking about it more and more, trying to figure out what that means. And the more I think about it, the more that I end up going back to my childhood and seeing how different I was from everybody else in terms of my motivations and what I wanted to do. And seeing how little I've changed from that time as well. This looks completely ridiculous because I cannot draw shapes and I cannot draw anything for that matter. But this right here is basically a representation of how I feel when I'm around other people for the most part. The star is in the circle surrounded by other circles, that I'm off in this enclosed space being enclosed in upon by other people. That's how it feels. It feels like even though you're talking to other people, even though you're mouthing the words, even though people can hear what you're saying, even though people understand what you're saying, even though you're a part of the situation that you're still in that circle. You're isolated. You're alone in the circle, even though you seem to be surrounded by other people. This right here, this is what it feels like. You're closed, you're entrapped. And I've noticed that the circle is, to use a phrase I keep using these days for some reason, squared, in that it's easier to be around these other people when I'm as authentic as I can be. When the person that I'm presenting to you represents the the kind of affectations that I want to be representing, that my self-perception, the consistent ideals behind the person who I would consider myself to be throughout all of this time, that my actions have represented through that self-perception. Um, the person who I feel the most comfortable being is, when I'm able to present that to you, I feel better. I feel less like I'm in this enclosed space where I'm not around other people, where I'm either surrounded by them or they simply don't exist, or like I'm entirely disconnected from the situation. This scenario is less of that. It's less of that when I'm able to be completely authentic, but it's still there. And that's what's so difficult to explain about this, is because I can be in scenarios where perhaps autopilot comes on, or I'm less considerate of what I'm saying, that I'm less disconnected to what I'm saying, I'm more disinhibited, that it's more like I'm acting out the scenario as it exists, as it's occurring, that I'm more of an active participant in it. But that's not significant enough to make note of it. Even though it's more there when I'm being authentic, even though the situation is more real, it's not significant enough to say that the circle is gone. It's not significant enough to say that I'm not in the circle still. I'm still in the circle. I'm still in the circle while all of the other people are outside of the circle. I still feel alone. It's just that I feel less alone. And that's what's so hard to explain, is that, even when I'm in this room right now, like, as I'm talking to you on this camera, I feel more like an active participant in what I'm doing, because this is a structured medium where I'm just letting everything out. This is a medium where the control that you have over the environment, over what you're doing, is kind of the point. It's what you're supposed to do. I can feel real when I'm doing this, but I can't feel real when I'm around other people. What does that mean? Is it that, I just want to be able to have complete control over what's presented, that, like, my self-perception is tooled in such a way that in order for it to feel real, and in order for me to get some sort of satisfaction out of it, I need it to be productive in some sense. I need it to be created as for something that people can consume. I don't know. I don't know what the cause of it is. I just know that it's there, that this continuous disconnect, it pervades everything that I do. And when I talk about, like, the rooms and the environments and stuff, what I'm talking about is feeling more connected to where I am and what I'm doing. Feeling like I am an active participant in what I'm doing. And as a result of that, I feel better as a whole. But that does not make any sense to someone who does not feel that way every single day. Like, they're watching everything that they do through a movie screen. Or if they're not, if they feel active in the situation that they're in, they feel entirely alone in doing so, like they're off in their own planet while everybody else is in space or something. I talked a lot about wanting to be an astronaut. Um, when I was really depressed one day, when I had some pretty serious mental stuff going on, suicide kind of stuff, I kept reiterating to my friend that I wanted to be an astronaut. And I didn't really know why at the time I kept saying that. And the more I thought about it, now, with this context, what is an astronaut? If not someone who is entirely alone, isolated from any semblance of human life, entirely one with the environment that they're in. That, like, you kind of have to make your spaceship is just your own little place. There's no contact with anybody else. There's no sense that what you're doing has to have some kind of connectivity to something else. You're just there. It's just a one man show. And when I get really upset, when I feel like nothing is going right, and that I want the entire world to burn up in flames, the most comforting thought that I can possibly have is that scenario where physically around me, the environment that I'm in represents the way that I'm feeling. And the way that I'm feeling is alone. The way that I'm usually feeling is alone. Um, I I don't know how to explain that to people. I don't know. Okay. I've taken the case that's long been on my phone off, and now I can more easily put it in this tripod thing. Although I've noticed, now that it's not in this tripod thing, it can more easily fall out, or now that it's not in the case that it was once in, it can more easily fall out of this tripod thing. I don't know if what I did was exactly a benefit or not. In a sense, it's a larger danger because if I drop the phone, it can more easily break. And it feels smaller in my hands, which is weird. I don't know if I like that, but
at the same time, that case was just really, really annoying in a lot of cases. Maybe if I had a better case, I wouldn't complain as much, but the fact that, I couldn't put the phone into tripods that the phone was made for was really annoying.
MDMA is a complicated drug for me to explain my experiences with because I think my experiences with it are probably like fundamentally different than most people's, in the sense that what most people tend to describe is a overwhelming sense of childlike empathy amped up by 100, with a sense of disinhibition underpinning it, to the point where, like, everything they say is something that they would never say in real life, like sober. They might say or do these things that they regret, and the headspace is not clear. They're just not in the kind of mind space that they do things that they would not normally do. And while I relate to that general sentiment that there are things that I have said on the drug that I would not have normally said, it wasn't as if I was saying those things without explicit intent, that I was not considering the words as I was saying them, or that I was not self-aware of the implications that those words may have had. In fact, many of the things that I've said on the drug have been a direct result of deliberating for long enough to think this would produce this reaction if I said this thing. And so the idea that it's so, socially empathetic and disinhibiting that you become this unguarded animal, that's not my experience at all. Where there was always some sense that there's something that I am not letting go of. There's something that the guard is there, that it's guarding, and that I'm not allowing myself to fully be taken by this experience. The self-aware me is always partly in control and not allowing for that. That there's something that I am not revealing, that I simply refuse to. And the hilarious thing about that is that I've performed those big reveal kind of moments on the drug with other people that were not even true, or like, if they were true, there were details of it that were altered just so I could see what reaction I would get from the other person, just because I wanted to see the way the other person would react, or I thought it was interesting to experiment with the idea of performing a kind of situation like that. But the situation wasn't real. I was just doing it, and I was entirely self-aware of that. Another strange thing, that perhaps this is more common, is an overwhelming sense of loneliness when I'm by myself on the drug. Texting people, it doesn't do any good. The sense of loneliness just continues eating and eating away at you. But when I was around physical people on the drug, I felt the same way. I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and disconnect, and the only way I could ignore that, not mitigate or get rid of, but ignore it, is through just talking incessantly, and talking and talking and talking, to where I'm more focused on what I'm saying than how I'm feeling. But the feeling is always kind of there in the background. It's always sort of there that I feel alone. And then I get into those habits of the performance of, like, well, if I'm going to maximize what this experience is intended for, then I ought to have some sort of big emotional reveal, right? I ought to I ought to say things in the most impactful way that I can. And I think because it's sort of a stimulant, and because generally I formulate sentences better on the drug, because I think a lot faster, and the thoughts feel more meaningful, and as I read back on them, they are more meaningful than something I would normally say, that allows me to combine that sense of profoundness with the disinhibition, the overwhelming sense of confidence in what you're saying that allows you to just say it. But those factors of becoming more social do not necessarily translate into being more authentic. And I think this is the extreme sort of disconnect I have with other people's experiences, is that I've had a lot of experiences with it that are either incredibly inauthentic or were authentic but were practiced in a way that, like, I was self-aware about what I was doing, and I saw the situation again in third person, not as an active participant in what was happening. And if I still feel like I'm in third person mode while I'm using that, the drug that's kind of known to be the thing that gets people out of third person if they're typically in it, what implications does that have on how I think in general? If that's the one that doesn't allow me to break through, if not even that can do it, what does that say about me? What does it say about me that I would performatively act as a character on the drug, opposed to being comfortable enough to just let everything out? I mean, when it's used in PTSD patients, that's kind of the idea, is that you just let everything out, and yet I'm either incapable of doing that, or the guard is up so strong that I simply don't allow for it. When I look at the drugs that I've been the most interested in terms of just like sheer enjoyment, or have found myself using the most, they're not particularly interesting ones. I mean, that's an interesting one. There's a huge array of feelings, of cascading feelings that you tend to get on it. It's colors, visuals, these kind of things. You can list out so many cool things that it does that makes it interesting, and yet what I come away with it from, or what I come away from it with, is I felt a lot of euphoria in my body, but I also felt incredibly alone no matter who I was with, and I had this strange, clear-headed performativeness to me that was strange and inauthentic. Like, no one else tends to say that. I seem to be the only one who's relayed that experience. But when I look at, like, back when I had used opiates pretty regularly from all of the pills that I had gotten from my kidney stone operation, I had a whole bunch of opiates that I was given, oxycodone and hydrocodone. Oxycodone because I went to a separate hospital to get it. I had told them that the hydrocodone wasn't working and that I was still in pain, and they just gave me oxycodone. I also had a concern about the operation because there was a nurse who told us that I wasn't given antibiotics during the operation, which came down to just an error on like the paper that they had. So part of the reason I had to go to that other emergency room was just to make sure that there was nothing wrong with me, that I didn't have an infection, which turned out to just be an error of human communication. But in the process of doing that, I got to try oxycodone as opposed to the hydrocodone that I had a shit ton of pills for. And so I had both of those for quite some time that I could play around with, and I absolutely loved the feeling that I had, because I just stopped caring about anything around me. That the sense of violence that I had in my life from like school, and that was just in my own mind, it completely dissipated. That I just felt good, that there was no sense of anxiety or worry to anything that was going on. It was completely disappeared. When I look at benzodiazepines, like Xanax is the obvious one, but you can. I haven't tried like triazolam or the clonazepam and those other strong ones, but I've had analogs of them, like canazolam I've had, which is an analog of triazolam. And it's just incredibly strong. Like the disinhibition that you feel, the relief of anxiety is like insanely strong. You feel it in your entire body. It's sort of a difficult thing to put into words, but the lack of care that you have for everything that is going around you is just so extreme that it becomes euphoric, because you spend all of this time caring, and now it's completely gone. Alcohol, I used to drink like every single day just because I didn't want to deal with what was in my own mind. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want I didn't want to have to live with the consequences of having a spirit. And so I would use alcohol to completely suppress my emotions. And when I look at those, the depressants, the depressant category being the one that I had found the most recreational use in, I think it says something about me. I think it says something about the kind of person that I am, because like, if I can't get meaningful experiences out of Molly, and if marijuana has had a tendency in the past to make me anxious, not really anymore. These days, it's mostly like an anxiety reliever, but as I was starting out with it, it certainly induced quite a bit. When I look at my experiences with psychedelics, have largely been traumatic, except for one really difficult trip that I had that with LSA that sort of helped me kind of heal from a trauma thing that I had been going through. That didn't make it less difficult, though. Like, acid, largely incredibly negative. Like, I've had like the acid trip that I had ultimately ended up being positive because it made me quit drugs, and that was a good thing. But the actual experience itself was like insanely difficult. I had never been confronted so directly with so many horrifying thoughts before, and these are generally things that increase inhibitions. Stimulants, for example, I really don't like stimulants. They just give me anxiety and heart palpitations, and I don't find them particularly useful. They're just very uncomfortable for me. You go down the list, all of the inhibition increasing drugs I have incredibly negative experiences with, because it raises the inhibitions of a mind that is already fractured and in pain. When I look at dissociatives, the only ones I really have any experience with are DXM and 3-MeO-PCP. I liked DXM at low doses because it was like alcohol, again, a depressant. And I only used 3-MeO-PCP once, but the experience I came away from it with was very confusing, because not only did I cry on the drug, which that's not a usual thing for dissociatives, and giggled, continued giggling over and over again for like a huge span of time when I was in a call with a friend of mine. I also had a conversation with her where she had told me that this isn't the drug that's doing this to you. Something happened to you that keeps you from being able to have these experiences at your baseline. But at your baseline, this is who you are. The sort of laughing, happy-go-lucky person who cries and wants to tell you that you appreciate them. It was interesting to me that I wasn't disinhibited enough to not constantly apologize for mistakes that I make when I'm speaking, because I still did that on the drug. But I was disinhibited enough to cry, and I was disinhibited enough to be relatively honest emotionally. And she was just telling me, yeah, that's not the drug that does that, it's you. This is just who you are. Something happened to you that's keeping that thing inside. And I keep thinking about that experience. Like, there were things that happened to me that don't allow me to feel the way that other people do, or don't allow me to show my feelings the way that other people can. And I've been trying to figure out why some of these reactions have been so distinct and different. And I think largely what it is that my brain is geared towards depressants. It's geared towards decoupling everything and making me care less. Because when I do care, I care way too much, and it hurts. And the kind of things that that my brain is privy to caring about are terrifying, because I haven't worked through them, and I don't know if I ever can. When there's another thing I wanted to mention. What was it? I forgot what it was. Oh yeah, beta blockers. I took beta blockers. When I took beta blockers for the first time, it was incredibly euphoric for me. Like it felt like a pure dopamine rush. And that was the moment where I knew something was wrong with me, is because beta blockers are not recreational drugs. They are not recreational drugs by any stretch of the imagination. They just lower your blood pressure, but they're often used by performers, by musicians, in order to suppress the physical symptoms of anxiety, and sometimes used by people to suppress stress, but they're not recreational. People have only been addicted to them because they were using them for that functional purpose. And the first time that I had taken one, I was so overcome by a sense of calmness and pleasure and euphoria that I just continued picking my dog up and like throwing him above my stomach. And I was just so happy that like I was just laying in my bed feeling so good that like everything was okay. And it was because throughout that day and through most of my days, the physical symptoms of anxiety are eating away at me. My brain eating away at me. Stress eating away at me. That's why so much of my hair turns white. That's why so much of my hair falls out. It's because of stress. And even though there is no scientific basis for that experience to be euphoric, that it's not supposed to do that, it did that to me because of those things. And that's why my brain is geared towards depressants. And that's also why that acid trip had taught me that I really shouldn't be using drugs at this time, because I'm at a point in my life where using them is largely unhealthy, that my use of them is hiding from a broader problem that has to be addressed. And that realization was probably one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had, and it's something that I continue to think about in the context of all of these things you heard previously in this video.